what I'd like to do for the next 35 to 40 minutes is to talk about tariffs and their consequences, but the way in which I want to talk about it is I want to use the current international situation as a motivation to help us to understand the history as well as the economic analysis of tariffs and their consequences, both expected, unexpected, and undesirable. Okay? The first thing I want to do is to motivate this discussion from a quote which comes from Dr. Manuel Ayal's book, Not a Zero-Sum Game, previously published as an article called Property Rights and the General Theory Exchange. Now, all of you have taken economic process, so you've learned about the law of comparative advantage. However, there's an important aspect of our understanding about the relationship between private property and free trade, one that is overlooked in many textbooks, but not what you've learned here, which is the case for free trade is oftentimes treated as independent from microeconomic theory, one that incorporates property rights analysis. But as you can see from this quote here, Ayal states that trade is a fundamental manifestation of your property right. Now, why is that important? Trade is oftentimes understood as being a zero-sum game, hence the title of the book, Not a Zero-Sum Game. However, the point that I want to make here is that if trade is a positive sum game, as I'm going to be talking about, then what that implies is that impediments, interventions into trade in the form of tariffs are going to lead to a negative sum game. And that negative sum game can become not only destructive, but potentially violent. Another aspect of the case for property rights and its relationship to trade is to understand that property rights operate as entrepreneurial filters. What do I mean by that? Generally speaking, when we think about entrepreneurship, we think of it in terms of something good, right? Entrepreneurship being productive, being positive sum. And indeed it is in the market process. But keep one thing in mind. The presence of scarcity implies competition. Competition implies profits. To the extent that profits are pursued through political competition as opposed to market competition, entrepreneurship can become unproductive and negative sum. The role that property rights play is to filter in productive entrepreneurship and to filter out unproductive entrepreneurship. So to the extent that the ability for individuals to exchange is impeded by tariffs, what it is going to do is not reduce competition. It's going to redirect competition into the political sphere in the form of an unproductive form of entrepreneurship, which is known as rent-seeking behavior. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Lastly, it's important to keep in mind, and this is relevant to what I just said, trade is a productive form of competition. Usually we think of competition as something that is cutthroat, but let's define our terms for a moment. What do we mean by the word competition? Competition is a process of conflict resolution. We live in a world of scarcity. That implies that there are conflicting ends about how to allocate resources. Many of you are holding a phone right now. What I can do is bash you over the head, take that phone. We just solved that conflict. It's mine. That is the history of humanity up until 300 years ago, when the predominant form of competition transitioned away from violence to trade. Now, I'm an economist. In order to get the resources that I want, because there's scarcity of resources, what do? I specialize in teaching and writing about economics, and I exchange my services for anyone who wishes to purchase them from me. And in turn, what do? I buy the goods and services for myself and for my family. I'm competing, but I'm competing in a peaceful and a productive manner. Trade is a peaceful and productive form of competition. Why is it important to understand that trade is an important manifestation of competition? Because, in effect, in the words attributed to Frederick Bastiat, if goods do not cross borders, armies will. To the extent that individuals are not able to compete for resources through productive specialization and trade, they will be incentivized to compete for resources through violence. The fundamental importance of trade, as I'm going to talk about in the course of my lecture, indeed it's crucial for economic development. But what's overwhelmingly important about trade is that it facilitates the conditions for peace, because it raises the cost of engaging in violent competition. In other words, you don't want to shoot your customers, right? It's very costly to you. Okay. So given that background, here are some questions to motivate our discussion. First of all, what effect does government regulation have on the entrepreneurial market process? The form of regulation that we're going to be talking about are known as tariffs. What are tariffs? Tariffs are fundamentally a tax on goods that are imported in an economy. When importers are faced with tariffs, they have to pay a tax in order for those goods to be brought into a country like Guatemala. However, if that was the whole story, that wouldn't be the problem, because business people face costs all the time. They have to hire capital, they have to hire labor, they have to get other resources. The issue with tariffs is that it's not just simply of raising the cost for consumers to purchase a good. What I'm going to be talking about is the unintended consequences of how it redirects entrepreneurial activity in ways that run counterproductive to the intended goals of tariffs. Now, what do we mean by regulation? Let's define our terms, such as a tariff. The role that a regulation such as a tariff plays is an imposition, you might say, by government decree or some kind of agency that is empowered with de facto government force to generate a set of outcomes that are otherwise regarded as not being able to be generated through the market process. So regulation is oftentimes justified because a market outcome is regarded as being undesirable. So the role of regulation is to intervene and create a more desirable market outcome, such as in the case of tariffs. Now, there are many reasons for tariffs. For the sake of time, I'm just going to focus for the purpose of our discussion on three intended goals of tariffs. One intended goal, and these are, again, I mean these as well-intended goals from the standpoint of a political official. One intended goal is to protect domestic workers from foreign competition. A second potential reason for tariffs is to raise government revenue, right? So for example, there are courts of law, there are roads to be built. You could think of all kinds of activities that governments engage in. Revenue needs to be raised to do so. So this could be one other reason to justify the existence of tariffs. And a third reason, as an intended goal of tariffs, is to deliver prosperity based on reciprocity. This is the notion that the only way that trade can be mutually beneficial is if it's regarded as reciprocal, right? So this idea is that if we reduce, a country only benefits from trade if another country lowers their tariffs. Otherwise, in order to protect themselves, they need to raise their tariffs. But this is a zero-sum notion of trade that is faulty. And let me give an example to illustrate the point I want to make about why prosperity, economic prosperity, is not based on trade being fair in the sense of reciprocal trade agreements. For example, there is a very simple way in which we can increase the cost of importing goods here in Guatemala. We could start blowing up ports in the Atlantic or the Pacific, right? That's going to make it very expensive to import goods. The ships are not going to be able to offload the goods, right? Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, that's ludicrous, right? Well, from an economic standpoint, tariffs have the same economic effect. The point I'm trying to make is, if one country decides to blow up their ports, that doesn't justify you then turning around in order to protect yourself by blowing up ports in your own country. Again, this is a silly example to only illustrate that the economic effect of tariffs as a tax on imports has the same economic effect of destroying technologies that make goods and services available internationally. Okay. In order to illustrate the effects of tariffs, I want to situate this in terms of a theoretical approach that you may be already familiar with from Ludwig von Mises, called the dynamics of interventionism. What we mean by interventionism is a series of regulations that are introduced in the market process, what Mises refers to as a hampered market economy. Israel Kirzner, a student of Ludwig von Mises, in his 1985 book called Discovery and the Capitalist Process, in that book, he develops a framework from the dynamics of interventionism called the perils of regulation. And there's this quote that illustrates the point that I want to make about the effects of tariffs on competition. Tariffs do not reduce foreign competition. What they do is they redirect competition in alternative forms. Yes, domestic producers may be shielded from foreign competition, but that does not reduce competition. It redirects competition in potentially unintended and unexpected ways. Okay. What does Kirzner state here? Government regulations and tariffs, for our conversation, drastically alter or disturb opportunities for entrepreneurial gain, but they don't eliminate them. Let me give an example to illustrate the point. I don't know if you've ever been to an arcade and you've played the game Whack-A-Mole, right? Where you hit the beaver. What happens when you hit the beaver? Another one pops up. This is Kirzner's point, right? By eliminating one profit opportunity, for example, a profit opportunity for importers to import foreign goods, well, that's not the whole story. The dynamics of interventionism implies that interventionism will be inherently unstable. Now, let me give an example to illustrate the instability. I'm not going to read from the PowerPoint since it's available to you. You'll be able to infer what I mean in the PowerPoint by giving this example. Just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the Cobra effect? Okay, this is going to be fun. The Cobra effect comes from, at least anecdotally, a story about a particular policy that was implemented in British colonial India when it was under British colonial authority. The British colonial authorities at the time identified a problem with venomous snakes that were poisoning people. So for the safety of individuals, there was a well-intended policy that was implemented, which was to incentivize people to start killing snakes in order to decrease the population of snakes in India. The effect of the policy was actually to increase the number of snakes in British colonial India. Now you might be saying, how did that happen? Well, how was the policy structured? People were paid a bounty, a payment, for turning in the heads of snakes. You see? They bring the snake, you get money. What the British colonial authorities, because they were operating outside the market process, could not anticipate is that they created a profit opportunity that otherwise would not have existed if the policy wasn't implemented. Namely, people started harvesting snakes in their backyard, right? By doing that, they turn in the heads and they can make a lot of money. But they did not have the knowledge generated in the market process to anticipate that counterproductive effect. Under that situation, a policymaker is faced with two choices. They could either repeal the regulation and admit failure, or they can double down and introduce a new regulation in order to correct for the unintended consequence that would have never even existed if the regulation didn't exist in the first place. So this is what we mean by interventionism being inherently unstable. This is the key point that we have to identify when it comes to trade policy that we learned from Bastiat. There are seen effects, and then there are the unseen effects of tariffs. Now, let's go to the first point that I made. Let's go to the first well-intended goal of tariffs, which is to protect domestic workers or domestic industries. Okay. What is the seen effect of a tariff? Let's just suppose in a particular country, there is a tariff imposed on imports of lumber and imports of steel. What's going to be the seen and immediate effect? The domestic producers of lumber and steel, well, the domestic prices of steel and lumber are going to go up. It's going to attract jobs into those industries, right? So the immediate seen effect, like, aha, see? The tariffs are creating jobs in the domestic economy. Okay? However, steel and lumber are inputs to building houses. Now, if steel and lumber become more expensive, that means it's going to be more expensive to build houses. If the price of housing goes up, the quantity demanded is going to be reduced. So what happens to the jobs of the people that are constructing those houses? Do they count less? Right? So that's the unseen effect. That's secondary. So as an economist, when we're evaluating tariffs, the question always is, and then what? That's the unseen. Okay. So in the long run, the net effect of tariffs is zero, but it leads to a misallocation of resources from more valued uses to less valued uses. Okay, so there are deadweight losses. There's waste associated with redirecting labor in that way. However, that's not the whole story. What we also have to take into account is that tariffs can initiate what Israel Kirzner refers to as superfluous discovery. That is, tariffs may channel entrepreneurship into new and unnecessarily desirable discovery processes, like the Cobra effect I talked about. Another example that Kirzner talks about as a superfluous discovery is that to the extent that tariffs are discretionary, meaning governments are picking winners and losers in the market, that is going to turn laws into legislation. And legislation itself will become a scarce commodity. What happens when something becomes scarce? People compete for it. They'll compete in the political process for that discretion to benefit themselves, that is, special interest groups, at the expense of consumers and other producers. So let me give an example from a wonderful paper that I highly recommend that you all read. This is a paper by a professor named Nathaniel Smith. at Sweetbriar College in Virginia. And what he evaluates is the unintended consequences in terms of superfluous discovery from a trade war known as the Chicken War of 1963, example. Now, how did the Chicken War started? In effect, what is now the European Union, at the time, the European Community, began to impose protection against the import of chicken from the United States. The United States has a comparative advantage in raising chicken compared to countries within what is now the European Union. So in order to protect domestic producers of chicken, they effectively banned the importation of chicken in what is now the European Union. The US retaliated with tariffs on lightweight trucks. So for example, a company like Volkswagen is a producer of lightweight trucks. Now, this brings me to my second example of a well-intended goal. You might say, well, the tariff itself may become a means to raise government revenue. It may be an alternative means to raise taxes instead of using an income tax or a value-added consumer tax. However, the tariff on lightweight trucks initiated a set of superfluous discovery processes that neither the beneficiaries of the tariff nor the regulators could anticipate. For example, in order to get around the tariff on lightweight trucks, companies like Toyota, Suzuki, Mazda, what did they begin to do? They began to locate their plants within the United States, and they began to do what? Import the inputs, because the inputs weren't subject to the tariff, in order to get around it and assemble it in the United States. Now go back to the dynamics of interventionism. The regulators now are faced with two choices. Either they can say, wait a minute, this is counterproductive. Or they could say we should implement a new tariff, a new regulation, in order to correct for the unintended consequence. So what did they do? Did they remove the tariff? No. What they did was they then imposed a tariff on the chassis, the body of the trucks. Now, what Ford Motor Company could not anticipate 40 years later is that they would begin to manufacture automobiles outside of the United States, particularly in Turkey. What has happened now is that a tariff that was intended to protect Ford Motor Company has made it more difficult for them to sell cars in the United States. This is a picture provided courtesy of Professor Smith. Notice what this truck has. It has some passenger seats on the back. Now, this is not a Ford, but I'm utilizing this picture as a point. What is another superfluous discovery that was introduced? Well, passenger vans are not subject to the same tariff of lightweight trucks. Now, how is a passenger van classified as a passenger van? If it has passenger seats in the back. So what Ford Motor Company began to do in order to import lightweight trucks, because after 2001, there was a recession in the United States and gasoline prices began to rise. Americans began to demand more lightweight trucks. So how did they get around it? They would put all of the seats and other features that would be required for a passenger van in order to import it as a passenger van and then remove it. Now think about how many resources are wasted just to get around that regulation. Those are resources that could have been utilized in a productive manner to produce goods and services. Right? This goes back to my point about property rights being entrepreneurial filters. To the extent that you distort the ability to exchange, you're redirecting entrepreneurial activity in unproductive ways that even may run counterproductive to the very people that are intended to benefit from it. Now, this is another important lesson, one that comes from one of the founders of public choice, named Gordon Tullock. By a show of hands, how many of you have either read his famous paper, but if not, it's fine, The Welfare Costs of Monopoly, Tariffs, and Theft? It is the article that introduced the concept of rent seeking. Now, many of you might be familiar with Bastiat's petition to the candlestick maker, in which the candlestick makers petition for protection against unfair competition from the sun. That is an example of rent seeking that Tullock revived. Now, to be completely clear, the term rent seeking was coined by an economist named Ann Kruger in a 1974 paper called The Political Economy of the Rent-Seeking Society. Okay, so the concept was revived, was rediscovered by Tullock in the second half of the 20th century, but the term is credited to Kruger. But let's define our terms, right? Because this is a term that requires unpacking. First of all, what do we mean by a rent? Right? A rent is not what you pay to your landlord in economics. What we mean by a rent is a return to an asset, a payment above opportunity cost, to a resource that is fixed, relatively fixed. So many of you might be able to name your favorite soccer player, right? Messi, Maradona, I know. They're paid huge salaries, right? Why are they being paid those huge salaries? To bid them away from other teams. But how many Messis are there? Just one, right? So the supply of Messis is perfectly inelastic. It's fixed. Now, rents by themselves are not necessarily unproductive. Rent seeking is, but rents by themselves are not. For example, how does Messi earn economic rents? Because he's a superior athlete, but he's not making anybody worse off. He's being paid that money because he's pleasing spectators. Okay. So in effect, rents can be created as a result of a natural scarcity in the market, being the best producer to offer a good at the highest quality and at the lowest price. What we mean by rent-seeking behavior is the competitive pursuit of rents as a result of an artificial scarcity created by government privileges. It is the time, effort, and resources expended either to capture or avert existing wealth. That's what we mean by that artificial scarcity. However, rent seeking itself is not a zero-sum game. It's not just purely a transfer. It's a negative-sum game. Why? Why is it a negative-sum game? Tariffs don't just pop out of nowhere. In effect, when tariffs are discretionary, that means that government officials can pick winners and losers. To the extent that they can pick winners and losers, then firms are going to spend resources to capture that discretion of a political official to their own benefit. I'll give an example, one from the United States. And this is why I love coming to Guatemala, because I love the Fanta here. It's fantastic. Oh. Now, if you go and see Fanta in the United States, it doesn't have the same color. It almost has like this golden bliss, like it's divine here. Why? In the US, there is a sugar lobby that has existed across Democratic and public administration and Republican administrations going back to the 80s. So the domestic price of sugar in the US is roughly 1.5 to 2 times the international price. The US does not have a comparative advantage in producing sugar. What does the Coca-Cola company do? They utilize corn syrup as a substitute for sweetening Fanta. Now, that tariff didn't come out of nowhere. So, for example, in order for firms to get that tariff, what do? They hire lawyers, lobbyists, individuals who have human capital. They have skills. with alternative uses, right? Suppose, for example, I stand to make, I don't know, 10 million quetzales from a tariff, and I pay one of you that are lawyers 1 million quetzales in order to lobby on my behalf. The $10 million, you might say, is a transfer. And you might say, wait, the $1 million to the lawyer is also a transfer. So where is their loss of wealth? Well, why am I paying the lawyer $1 million? Because I have to bid away that individual from an alternative productive use. In effect, what happens to that $1 million? It's wealth that's never realized. It's destroyed forever. So the net effect is one of a transfer, you might say, in the best case scenario, of the $9 million. 9 million quetzales, excuse me. But what I'm paying other individuals to capture this existing wealth, that implies that I'm utilizing resources that could have been used to produce wealth, instead are being expended to do what? Transfer wealth. Let me give an example to illustrate this point. Suppose that this auditorium was our own little economy, and the way we're going to measure GDP in this economy is economic literacy. Okay? And I'm going to be the referee of this game, the government. When you go to a class, what do you have? A syllabus, right? The syllabus has two purposes. One is to set the rules of the game, the expectations of how to do well in the class. The other expectation is to do what? To constrain the referee, the teacher, to do what? Assign the grades based on the learning process. But if the rules are impartial, we don't know beforehand what the grades are going to be. Okay? Now, let's suppose I tore up the syllabus. Okay? Because under the rules of the game, the unintended outcome is that everyone will compete for a high grade. And what will be the unintended outcome? Everyone's economic literacy should go up. But now I tear up the syllabus. How might you compete for a good grade? You might come up to me after class. Oh, Candela, you're the best professor ever. I love you so much. Here's some Fanta. Oh, by the way, what are the answers for the midterm next week? What just happened? You are now expending time, effort, and resources to capture that existing wealth. How are you all going to respond? You're all going to start kissing up to me, right? Now, you could have been spending your time learning economics and becoming more economically literate. What happens to that time, effort, and resources? They go trying to find out the answers. But that time, effort, and resources are scarce. It's lost forever. That's why tariffs, which are, when they are discretionary and violate the rule of law, lead to this negative sum outcome. That's not the end of the story. There's another concept developed called the transitional gains trap. Right? Think about, for example, all sorts of regulations that exist. Now, Tulloch developed this concept in the context of taxi cab medallions in New York City. Have any of you been to New York City before? Taxi cab drivers are not rich people, but they operate under licensing. And everyone, prior to the rise of Uber and Lyft, they had to pay more rather than less if the licensing didn't exist. So why is this the case? In effect, why does a particular type of regulation that protects producers continue to exist when it not only makes consumers worse off, but when, in effect, the very individuals being protected are not earning supernormal profits? Well, think about, for example, you're entering the taxi cab industry. I'll relate this to tariffs in a moment, right? New York City grants you the license. That's a windfall profit. What happens if I want to enter the taxi cab industry? The way I have to do it is to buy the medallion. But how much are you going to sell it to me for? The value of the rent. The rent is capitalized into the resale of the license. So I'm not going to be made as well off as you who earn the windfall profit. Initially, the initial beneficiaries get a windfall profit. Subsequent beneficiaries do not. How do we relate this back to tariffs? Tariffs, once they are created, is gonna attract land, labor, and capital. In order for producers to produce those goods and services, they have to bid away land, labor, and capital from alternative uses. So in effect, there are rent-seeking costs, but the market process itself is going to redirect resources towards that industry in a manner that is going to erode profits as well. Now, abolishing a tariff, what does public choice economics teach us? That the logic of the political process is to concentrate benefits on well-informed and a few special interest groups, which are well organized, and disperse costs on the masses of the population. I just told you about sugar tariffs in the US. I'm very upset about them. Do I know how much more I pay in sugar each year? I have no idea. It's not worth my time. Am I going to lobby my congressperson in order to eliminate the tariff? No. I don't have the resources to do that. Could I get a bunch of consumers to do that? Well, no, because there is a collective action problem. Eliminating the tariff would be a substantial cost for us, but the benefits would be dispersed across society. However, suppose, for example, there's a threat of the removal of the tariff. The sugar lobby is going to stand to lose millions of dollars. That's a concentrated cost upon them. And so therefore, moreover, because they are well organized, their collective action costs are lower. So this is how policies, once they're introduced, over time continue to exist, even if the beneficiaries of the policies or the benefits of the policies do not outlast the existing special interest group. Now, here's another important example from the not so distant past, the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. I don't know how many of you have heard of this before. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was the highest peacetime tariff in the United States history. The average import duty on goods imported into the United States was roughly 50%. The picture that you see here on the right is Hawley, and the left is Smoot, both Republicans. And notice in the New York Times here, there are 1,000 economists who signed a petition vetoing the tariff bill. Okay? Now, what was the rationale for implementing the Smoot-Hawley tariff? What was the political rationale for it? 1930 is the beginning of what would become the Great Depression. Now, how was trade policy determined in the United States at the time? At the congressional level. Today, it's at the presidential level, at the executive level, I should say, through what's called the Reciprocal Trade and Agreements Act. At that time, it was at the congressional level. And what that resulted in was a concept in public choice known as log rolling, right? Vote trading, right? So imagine the concept of log rolling goes as follows, right? Logs are hundreds of kilos heavy. I can't roll it by myself, but I could get one of you and say, hey, look, I'll do you a favor if you help me roll the log. And together, we can do it. How does this play out in the political process? Imagine someone who's in Pennsylvania, who their congressional district is concentrated with steelworkers. And I'm in Kansas, where my constituency, my voters, they are concentrated in wheat farming. So you who have the steelworkers, they are not a majority. And the farmers may not be a majority they are a majority in my district, but not nationally. So how do I get the votes? I'll come to you and say, hey, if you vote for my wheat tariff, I'll vote for your steel tariff. Concentrated benefit for my constituency, my voters, but a cost that's dispersed amongst all Americans. In other congressional districts, it doesn't matter to me. They're not voting in my district. Now, what was the unintended consequence of this process? Is that we saw that this high peacetime tariff as a result of log rolling. How do you think other countries are going to respond? They retaliated. They retaliated. Now, I don't want to appear melodramatic in this point that I want to make, but this point here is an important lesson from history that trade wars can indirectly, not directly, but indirectly lead to shooting wars. How? What would have been a very deep recession, admittedly, was deepened by the Great Depression. Countries retaliated against each other. What was the mantra at the time? Protectionism, isolationism, self-sufficiency. In the 1930s, what was on the rise in countries like Spain, Italy, and Germany? Fascism. Now, they were minority parties in the 1920s, but in desperate economic times, people will turn to anyone that will say, we're going to restore economic prosperity. It's what gave legitimacy to, for example, the Nazi Party in the 1930s, and Mussolini in Italy, and Franco in Spain. Again, the point I'm trying to make is not that the tariff itself deliberately led to that outcome, but to the extent that you increase the costs of competition through trade, what do? You decrease the cost of competing for resources through violent competition. Let me conclude with this last point to illustrate the point that I want to make, which is a declaration that was issued by a French statesman named Robert Schuman. Now, Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet were the founding fathers, for lack of a better word, of what became known as the European coal and steel community. The European coal and steel community is the forerunner, it's the ancestor of what is known today as the European Union. Now, what was the purpose of the European coal and steel community? At the time, the economies of Western Europe were completely devastated by World War II. Okay. Now, what I encourage you to do is go and read this declaration in its entirety so you don't see that I'm cherry-picking quotes. Why do I say that? Because what's at the forefront of the Schuman Declaration is not to utilize trade simply as a means of economic prosperity or development. It was a means by which to refacilitate peace in Europe. What does Schuman state here? The solidarity in production, thus established, will make it plain that any war between France and Germany becomes not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. This is a restatement of Montesquieu's do commerce thesis. Okay? Now, we would find it unimaginable today for France and Germany to be at war with each other. But we have to keep in mind, in the context of that time, France and Germany had been in 3 major wars within a period of 75 years. There was the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. There was World War I, beginning in 1914, and then the German invasion of France in 1940. 3 major wars, 3 generations. So what was at the forefront of their mind? We don't want this to happen again. So trade was utilized as a basis for reestablishing peaceful relations between countries. It's the reason that Ludwig von Mises uses the word in human action to refer to trade as catalactic competition. Hayek uses this word as well in Law, Legislation, and Liberty. Catalaxy. What does catalaxy mean, or catalactic competition? It comes from the Greek word, katalaktian, meaning to turn an enemy into a friend or to admit in the community. So the final point that I want to make here is that the immediate tariffs, the immediate effect of tariffs, may be relatively small and insignificant. But if the dynamics of interventionism teach us anything, it is uncertain what the consequences of tariffs could be in the future. I thank you for your attention.